Welcome, everyone, to the Week 16 edition of our Monday show. We're going to recap the Week 15 NFL action and then dive into those Week 16 matchups. I'm your host, as always, Josh Larky. Joined with me, as always, is my co-host, Ryan Reynolds. We are of the 33rd team. Ryan, let's dive right into that Thursday night game.
It's actually a sneaky decent one here, Josh. We got the Rams versus the Saints. Rams are 4-point home favorites currently. Game total here is 44.5 points. The Saints got back on track against a Giants team that was on a 3-game winning streak. They had 7 sacks against Tommy DeVito. Carr was efficient, spread the ball around to 10 different receivers. Chris Olave was out. They still had a decent, but not exactly eye-popping offense. You have any positive things to say about the Saints offense going forward, Josh?
Well, at least for fantasy purposes, Alvin Kamara, after what was pretty much a 50-50 split with Jamal Williams with a lot of the work 2 weeks ago, last week, or yesterday, he outcarried Jamal 16-8. He only ran 13 routes to Jamal's 9, but it was clear that when he was running a route, the intention was to target him. He caught all 5 of his targets on those 13 routes for 44 receiving yards. I don't have any pass game notes. Nobody really stepped up of note. Like you said, it was a very spread out attack, and Olave should be back for this game against the Rams.
And speaking of the Rams, Josh, they've won 4 of their last 5. That one loss came to the Ravens in Baltimore in overtime. Rams are pretty hot, pretty dangerous team entering the final stretch of the season here. The consistent thing for me for Los Angeles this season, Josh, is every time I watch them, I leave thinking that Matthew Stafford is one of the 5 most important players this season. He's kept this team afloat all year, carries the most weeks. That said, Josh, Kyren Williams, I've said this a number of times, Nick Botiford was on him last year. He continues to surprise me on a regular basis, had another strong game. What do you think about with the Rams here, Josh?
Yeah, Kyren, I think one thing that's good to note for fantasy managers, he lost 2 fumbles in this game, and McVay really didn't care. Still had 27 carries, 152 yards rushing, and a touchdown. Also had 7 targets. That is 34 opportunities for the 200-pound running back, despite the 2 fumbles. Stafford, as you mentioned, he was excellent. Completed 76% of his passes against Washington. As expected, he shredded them. The volume wasn't as good as we were hoping for, 258 passing yards, 2 touchdowns. Still a solid day, and ultimately Kyren was just too efficient on the ground, and Stafford just didn't have to do much. Kupp, Puka, they split the team lead with 8 targets apiece. That was a 25% target share for each of them. Kupp was the efficient one, though. Looks like he's fully healthy again. He had the 8 catches on his 8 targets for over 100 yards. He scored the touchdown. Puka was just 5 catches, 50 yards. They might be a little bit hard to predict each week who goes off, but I think now that Kupp is healthy again, he is the clear preferred option and should be more efficient most weeks.
That's Larky Tweets. This Thursday, we'll be back for our Thursday show where we'll talk about some rankings disparities that Josh has versus consensus. We'll try to help you out with some fantasy playoffs focused content, and we'll talk about the NFC playoff picture at length. We have another Saturday lineup here, Josh. First up, Steelers versus Bengals. Steelers are 2.5-point home underdogs. Game total here is 38 points. Pittsburgh's an underdog despite beating Jake Browning's Bengals a few weeks ago because of their quarterback play. They're pivoting to Mason Rudolph here. What do you think about the Steelers offense, Josh?
I really don't have much positively to say about this team. I have low expectations. This is the guy that is playing behind Mitch Trubisky. And I think that kind of tells you all that you need to know. On the rushing end, Jaylen Warren might get extra work in this game. Najee Harris lost a fumble. His usage overall was terrible. There were reports that came out from Steeler Nation, which is the top Steelers fan blog, that Najee Harris is a, quote, teacher's pet to Mike Tomlin and that a lot of the team is turning on him. I don't know what to make of that, but generally these fan blogs are overly positive. So I thought that was actually a very interesting headline, and the usage kind of reflected it. Jaylen Warren, 37 snaps to Najee Harris's 18, basically was on the field twice as much as him. While Harris had 12 carries to Warren's 10, Warren did have more rushing yards. Warren had 2 of the 3 red zone carries, and Jaylen Warren ran 25 routes to Najee Harris's 4. Najee was essentially not allowed to touch the ball in the passing game. Warren turned those 25 routes into 6 targets and caught 5 for 28 yards. And the fantasy points kind of reflect the big usage where Warren had 12 fantasy points even without a touchdown, and Najee Harris had 3. In this game, I will be starting Warren, and I would recommend sitting Najee Harris.
Yeah, the other thing I'll throw in there with the passing game for the running backs is Rudolph's a more stationary quarterback than Trubisky, so maybe a small uptick there. From the Bengals side of things, Josh, there's a phrase in sports betting: you run bad, you're on a good run, all the variants in between. The Bengals are running very, very well. They were more or less shut down for most of the game against the Vikings last week. Then at the end of the game, it started with a Jake Browning, play extended to the right, threw a prayer up to T. Higgins. T. Higgins caught it, miraculously scored on it by putting his arm behind his head. And then, another good throw in overtime to Tyler Boyd, but he continues to have these massive stat lines. And when you watch him, it's kind of, it's kind of not like the true reality of how he played. But, that said, you got to give him credit. Bengals are in the playoff picture because he's been solid. Jamar Chase got hurt in this game, Josh. So I'm curious what you're thinking with Cincinnati here.
Yeah, Jamar Chase has an AC joint sprain. We'll probably find out later this week if he's going to play week 16. I would assume that because it's a divisional game and since they're in the thick of the playoff hunt, that he will try to suit up. If I remember correctly, it's about 50-50 if receivers miss time with the AC joint sprain. Speaking of Jake Browning, they finally let it rip. I'm kind of with you. I thought the Boyd throw was his most impressive. On the run throw to Boyd to seal the field goal and the win in overtime.
Yep.
Browning, after 2 games where his average throw depth was exactly 4.5 yards, this past week doubled it. His average depth of target was 9 yards, and I think that was notable. He threw for 324 yards, and it's a lot easier to throw for more yards when you're throwing the ball downfield. I wouldn't expect him to complete 69% of his passes each week when he's throwing that far downfield. A lot of that was on the receivers, but we have to give him credit. 20 fantasy points or more, all 3 of his starts. And just like we discussed last week, guys, please don't start Chase Brown. He's still more efficient than Mixon. Very, very hard, though, when a guy's going to get you 7 carries and 3 targets, and it does not have red zone or goal line work.
If you're still alive in the fantasy playoffs, we're going to do Discord sweeps this week to try to help you out. Start sick questions. Josh will hop in Saturday afternoon to specifically discuss the Jamar Chase situation. We're going to try to hit that as late as we can. I'll hop in on Thursday before the Thursday night game in case you have questions specifically for that game. Otherwise, we're going to wait for those till later in the week when we have more information. Next up, Josh, Chargers versus Bills. I don't take any pleasure in talking about your Chargers here. They're 14-point home underdogs. They just fired their head coach. 42.5-point game total. To put it bluntly, that was a disgrace last week. No team should give up 63 points to Aiden O'Connell. Everything about that was a disaster. I actually kind of feel a little bad for Brandon Staley, even though I've never been huge on him. That was a terrible, terrible effort. What are you thinking about Easton Stick's Chargers to the rest of the season?
I have no confidence, but just to pile on in terms of how, yes, Brandon Staley did not coach a good game, but the Chargers did not play a good game. Easton Stick lost 2 fumbles at quarterback. Josh Kelly lost a fumble at running back. Darius Davis lost a fumble on special teams. It was just a brutal performance, and I have almost nothing to take away at this point. Austin Eckler barely played. We'll see if Keenan Allen returns for this game. If he does, I'm at least a little more interested in what the Chargers offense can do. But overall, I think we need to treat this team like a bottom 5 offense heading into this upcoming game against a red-hot Bills team.
Yeah, it was like last year's Rams blowout of the Broncos, just like kind of, like you guys got blown out by the Raiders this bad, just wild stuff. Poor Keenan Allen. For the Bills, Josh, on the other side of the spectrum, I said before the Chiefs game that I think Buffalo's going to go on a run, make the playoffs, and I think they're at least going to get to the AFC Championship if this continues. And, here we are. What's most interesting, though, is Josh Allen. They stopped Dallas and pretty much across the board, but Josh Allen only had 94 passing yards. So I think that's, more Dallas-centric than anything else, but Buffalo's becoming more versatile here, Josh. What do you think about their offense going forward?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, is that they can beat you in so many ways. Josh Allen completed 7 passes in a game where they just blew the doors off of the Cowboys. James Cook was the one who had the big day. He put up a Kyron Williams-esque stat line. These small running backs are having a nice little comeback this year. Cook had 25 carries, 179 rushing yards, and a touchdown, 3 targets. And because of Allen not passing, that was actually a 23% target share, second on the team. Caught 2 of them for 42 yards and another touchdown. Since the OC has been fired, James Cook's usage has skyrocketed. And Stephon Diggs' season just continues to be frustrating. Diggs had 5 targets. That was nearly a 40% target share, but again, 5 targets, caught 4 for 48 yards. He now has under 9 fantasy points 4 of his past 5 games. He is, like most first-round picks this year, looking like a league loser. It's pretty much Christian McCaffrey or bust, and a little bit of CeeDee Lamb sprinkled in for everyone that was taking a first-round pick, which should be all of us.
Yeah. Next up, Josh, to Sunday now. Vikings versus Lions. Vikings are 3.5-point home favorites. Game total here is 47 points. Brian Flores' defense has been incredible this year. If there was an assistant coach of the year award, an official one, he'd probably have to go to him. But they didn't hold up late against Cincinnati. T. Higgins' score was a bit of a fluky play, but again, like you said before, the Tyler Boyd pass from Jake Browning is essentially what ended up costing the Vikings a win and maybe the playoffs. I'll say this though, Nick Mullins' offense was better than I expected last week, and more surprisingly, they actually ran the ball effectively. So, like we've talked about all year, you don't like Alexander Madison as a person. Ty Chandler, we've liked more as an athlete, but the usage, Josh, I know I was impressed with it.
Yeah, 23 carries for 132 yards and a touchdown, 4 targets, caught 3 for 25 yards. This is a guy that's maybe 195 pounds soaking wet. And we actually did talk about this quite a bit last week where we said, guys, we don't quite know how many touches he can handle, but it's hard not to see Ty Chandler being fantasy relevant purely because there's nobody else in this backfield. Sure enough, the only other back in this backfield, Kene Nwangwu, like we mentioned, he's a special teamer. He had 1 carry. This was 27 opportunities for Chandler. When we look at Mullins' first start, the game plan was conservative but effective. He threw for over 300 yards, but his average depth of target was just 6.5 yards, which is higher than just about no quarterbacks other than Bryce Young. When we look at the target split, Jefferson was the target leader. He caught 7 of his 10 targets for 84 yards. His average depth of target was 13 yards. Then what's interesting is that Hawkinson and Addison were used so close to the line of scrimmage. I'd say Addison's stat line was one of the flukier ones of the season. He only had 6 targets. He only had 53 air yards on them, but he had 6 catches on 6 targets for 111 yards and a touchdown. I'd say one of the weirder plays was when the defender kind of jumped at his 5-yard reception, missed. Addison catches it and just kind of runs untouched for 40 yards. That was kind of the name of the day, was Addison getting every single break possible while Jefferson really had to work for his yardage. But I think for Jefferson fantasy managers that sneak through, it's a positive that he had the 31% target share. He had the massive bulk of the team's air yards. So Chandler and Jefferson should be quite strong starts against this pass funnel Lions defense.
Speaking of Lions, Josh, strong bounce back game offensively. The Broncos have been a very good defense for 2 months now. That they, Denver won 6 out of their last 7 before this matchup. The defense primarily drove the bus for that stretch. And, Detroit was good in both phases. Jared Goff was excellent and efficient. Jahmyr Gibbs looked like a world beater. They're capable on that end. And I also think from a power ranking standpoint, I think there's 8 teams that are dangerous. I think the Lions are at the back end of that, but they are, especially if their defense plays better. Wasn't kind of really impressed, but it was at least a step in the right direction on that side of the ball against Denver. What do you got on Detroit, Josh?
Yeah, a few interesting notes. We talked about how there would probably be positive game script and it would be a Montgomery game for touches. It was. He had 19 touches to Gibbs' 13, but like you said, Gibbs is just so fast. He's probably one of the 5 fastest players in the NFL at this point, mixed with his just ridiculous acceleration. So while Montgomery had the 19 touches, Gibbs had 25 fantasy points to Montgomery's 10 because Gibbs had 100 yards on the ground. He had 2 total touchdowns, 1 through the air, 1 on the ground, and he actually had 3 of the team's 5 red zone carries. So that I thought that was interesting that the 1 goal line attempt actually went to Gibbs, not Montgomery. The one other usage note, Jameson Williams finally had more than 2 catches in a game. His 7 targets were a 22% target share. He caught 4 for 47 yards. It's not that sexy, but everyone is going to be looking at Sam Laporta because Sam Laporta had 5 for 56 receiving with 3 touchdowns. JMO actually out-targeted him. And I think that those in dynasty leagues, this is kind of a sneaky buy window where I don't think anyone out there is very impressed with 4 catches for 47 yards. They're just busy looking at, man, I wish I had the Sam Laporta stat line. Jameson Williams, a slight sign of life in this game.
Yeah, the first play of the game too was a screen to Williams too, so that's good news in itself. Next up, Josh, Panthers versus Packers. Panthers are 4.5-point home underdogs here. Game total here is 36. Carolina won their second game of the season. Their defense has put together a few scrappy efforts over the course of the year, but their offense continues to be unwatchable. That game against the Falcons last week, Josh, and Giants Patriots, in my opinion, were the two worst games of the year. That includes the Chargers massacre that you had to suffer last week. What do you got on Carolina, Josh?
Yeah, I think if you're a fan of football, you still want to enjoy this game. A 9-7 decisive victory over those Falcons. This is now 7 straight games where the Panthers have passed for under 200 passing yards. 7 straight games. They have 2 passing touchdowns total in those 7 games. You can't start any of these players. The best example is just the weekly Jonathan Mingo update that I love to give. His target share is at least 20% in 6 straight games, and he's averaging under 7 fantasy points a game during that stretch. It's hard to imagine that someone could have 3 catches and 35 yards despite over 7 targets per game. And then the last one is that Chuba Hubbard continues to be a revelation with his usage since Frank Reich was fired as head coach. At least 22 carries in all 3 games since Reich was fired. Sanders never reached 20 carries in a game earlier this year when he was the workhorse for Carolina.
Packers side of things, Josh, that was a horrifyingly bad loss to Tampa at home last week. Baker Mayfield lit them up. I'll talk more about that later. Jordan Love is fine. You know, he's the 20th best quarterback in the league. He's in that range. He can, we just saw this team beat Detroit and Kansas City and now lose to the Giants and Buccaneers in back-to-back weeks. So, the offense is different without Christian Watson. Jalen Reed was banged up last week. What do you got on Green Bay, Josh?
Yeah, we'll see what happens with Reed. It seems like he might have turf toe. We'll kind of monitor that throughout the week. That would be kind of crushing to everyone who's kind of been riding him as a flex the last few weeks. The big one would be that should something happen to Reed, I think Dontavian Wicks is the big beneficiary. He's the guy that's been surging. He had 6 catches, 97 yards this past week. Romeo Doubs really looks like the odd man out regardless of injury status. He now has under 40 receiving yards in 8 of his last 10 games. And then the last note is we'll look at A.J. Dillon's injury status closely. We've talked at length about how the Panthers are receive to most running games, I guess, except if you're the Falcons last week. So should Dillon miss, this could just be a massive Aaron Jones game. He didn't actually have any stats this past week, but I thought he looked very, very explosive. He looked back from his injury. So that's at least a positive note, is that Jones might sneak into the fantasy RB1 conversation should Dillon miss this contest.
Next up, Josh, Falcons versus Colts. Falcons are 2-point home underdogs. Game total here's 44.5 points. Arthur Smith's back to doing weird things against Josh. You'll talk about the usage there, but let me frame my displeasure here in this way to you, Josh. I was probably the first person to turn on Brandon Staley because back in week 9 of 2021 in his first year, I had $3,000 on the Chargers at -2.5. It was one of my favorite bets of the year. It was against the Eagles in Philly, and they just let Philly run the ball down their throat without adjusting. Philly couldn't throw. Guy just didn't adjust. It's always been on my radar since then. I've never really cared for him, And similarly, I think the Jets should move on from Robert Salah. I think I saw Joe Banner say that on Twitter. Like I see it the same way as Joe. I don't want these people to lose their jobs, though. I don't want to see Arthur Smith be in charge of an NFL team ever again after this season. Josh, are you with me on this?
Oh, we are definitely on team fire Arthur Smith. We talked about how Tyler Algier would see a usage spike in this game. It's very unfortunate just how right we were and that it came at the expense of everyone that we actually like. Tyler Algier had 15 touches in this game. Bijan Robinson, Kyle Pitts, Drake London did not have Tyler Algier's 15 touches. They combined for 13, and I think that tells you all you need to know. The fact that they did nothing at quarterback this offseason, it's egregious. Desmond Ridder had one of the worst interceptions I've seen this year in the fourth quarter. They could have put the game away, and instead, Ryan, you watch every snap of every game. What was Ridder even trying to do there? Because it just looked like he didn't feel like winning this game.
This is the way I can put that, Josh. I watched Sunday Football with a guy who loves football. He coaches linebackers in high school, and we both audibly laughed when the replay came on for that. Just like, what? I have no idea what he's trying to do there. It was literally unbelievable. On the Colts side of things, Josh, I think we learned last week that any running back in Shane Steichen's offense this year can be very productive. Before we got hurt, before Michael Pittman took that brutal hit too, I think my comp of him of Michael Thomas in his prime in terms of skill set I'm actually starting to like that more a little bit each week. Not sure what his injury status is, if he's going to be able to play. I think the Colts are the most overachieving team in the league, so I don't want to go all in on them, here. But at this point, this has been a top 10 offense from a performance standpoint. So I'm curious, what do you think about Indianapolis across the board, John?
Yeah, it's very impressive when you also consider just how many injuries they've had. Star running back Jonathan Taylor has only played half the games this year. Their 4th overall pick, quarterback Anthony Richardson, hasn't played really since September. Michael Pittman was concussed this past week. It's a laundry list. One positive, though, Zach Moss's shoulder injury from the horse collar tackle may not keep him out of this week. We'll discuss this more on the waiver wire show tomorrow. As we get more info, if it's going to be Zach Moss or if the Trey Sermon, Tyler Goodson committee is going to be in effect. And then one thing that was interesting is that Alec Pierce ran 50% more routes this past week than Josh Downs. We've both been Downs guys, not Pierce guys, but sometimes you have to adjust. And if the Colts are just not going to give Josh Downs a full-time role, and Alec Pierce is, then that's pretty concerning for the rest of season for Josh Downs.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Josh. And was something I noticed as soon as Pittman went down, I think the first pass they had was a slant to Pierce, which was essentially a Pittman route. So I think you're right there. I think Pierce is going to be his direct replacement if he misses time. Next up, Josh, a very good game, actually. Texans versus Browns. Texans are 2.5-point home favorites, which says that they're expecting C.J. Stroud back. Game total here is 42 points. I didn't know Case Keenum was going to start this game this time last week. Sneaky sharp move by Houston. Singletary had a lot of his production late, but he was a big factor here. The defense, was excellent. DeMeco Ryans, this is a game he won in a lot of ways, so that's encouraging for Houston both now and going forward. Well, with Stroud coming back, what do you think about Houston here, Josh?
Yeah, there's a lot of moving parts. C.J. Stroud should return from the concussion. As of today, he is still in the concussion protocol, but fortunately it's Monday. They play Sunday. Noah Brown had 11 targets. He caught 8 for 82 yards and a touchdown. That's over 20 fantasy points. We'll see if Nico Collins and his calf strain are going to play this week. But I think either way, Noah Brown is at least an interesting flex play at the very least, despite the Browns defense being pretty solid. And then Devin Singletary was the bell cow of bell cows. 26 carries for 121 yards, 21 routes run. He had 5 targets. He caught 4 of them. And if we look at that, that is 30 combined touches. We had 1 touch for Dare Ogunbowale and 1 touch for Dameon Pierce. I think you and I are both scratching our heads as to what happened to Dameon Pierce. There's been no info, but I think the one thing we can do is actually trust DeMeco Ryans that Devin Singletary is their best option at running back. I think if anyone's going to get the benefit of the doubt, it's going to be Ryans from what we've seen this year. So I'm just going to expect Singletary to be the absolute man for the rest of the season, and I'll be ranking him in fantasy as such tomorrow.
Yeah, I think you're right there, Josh. On the Cleveland side of things, you've said a few nice things about me on these shows over the course of the year, but something in particular that I appreciate is you say I'm not an analytics guy, but I'm very aware of analytics. I'm not ignorant to them. And I think Joe Flacco throwing 44 passes to 17 Cleveland Browns running back carries is a prime example of how being pass-centric can be an edge in games. And I'm going to explain why. The Bears defense more or less dominated Cleveland. They couldn't run the ball. That's why they had 17 carries. Flacco threw 3 picks and took 4 sacks. So it's not like he played well, but 3 of Cleveland's scoring drives were basically manufactured because of big plays. Basically, Flacco's volume led to these 3 plays. Marquise Goodwin had a 57-yard reception. Amari Cooper, a 51-yard touchdown. And then David Njoku had a 34-yard reception that led to a field goal. If they try to run the ball and play like a muddy game plan, I think they lose 17-3 to Chicago. Just letting Flacco air it out, even though he was struggling, is actually why they won this game. I'm curious if we're aligned on here. What do you think about Flacco? What do you think about this team in general?
Yeah, I would completely agree. And I've got a good stat as to why the passing won the game for them. Joe Flacco had 125 passing yards in those final 3 minutes of the game to win it. It's Ryan, you'd be hard pressed to have 125 rushing yards over the course of 3 minutes with how NFL game clocks work. So full agreement there. David Njoku quietly having an excellent season. He is now the tight end 7 with 12.1 fantasy points per game. For context, George Kittle is the tight end 6 at 12.7. Njoku only half a fantasy point per game behind Kittle now. People that drafted George Kittle in fantasy have generally been pretty happy. he's been inconsistent, but I think the big games have kind of outweighed the letdown spots. And Njoku pretty much neck and neck with him at this point.
Josh's fantasy rankings will be on the 33rdteam.com tomorrow afternoon on Tuesday. Kev Wheeler, Matthew Hill give their rankings as well, and I'll provide some defenses in that mix. Jets versus Commanders is next, Josh. Jets are 3-point home favorites. Game total here is 38 points. I'm surprised the Jets defense was trucked by Miami last week. I wasn't expecting that at all. That said, the return to reality for the offense wasn't a surprise in the slightest. Zach Wilson got banged up in that game too. What are you thinking about the Jets offense going forward, Josh?
I really don't have much faith. We like the Dolphins defense, but they were also banged up this week. The Dolphins overall had 6 sacks on the Jets. The Jets lost 2 fumbles. The Jets threw 2 interceptions. And I think they might be throwing in the towel in general. Breece Hall only had 6 carries for 12 yards rushing. He only ran 11 routes. Israel Abanikanda had 4 carries to Breece Hall's 6. He ran more routes than Breece Hall overall. I don't really know what this Jets team is doing. If I remember correctly, they're now eliminated from playoff contention. Yep. So even if Aaron Rodgers makes the miraculous comeback, like he said he is, where he said he's medically cleared to play, it's just too little too late at this point. So zero faith. This is probably one of 3 offenses that can't take advantage of the Washington defense. I'd actually say at this point, the Bailey Zappi Patriots are a better offense than the Jets. I think it's just kind of them and the Giants as to who the truly worst offense is. And I don't think I could fault anyone who say that the Jets are the worst offense in the NFL right now.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you because we want to purposely target the Commanders, but we can't in this matchup. At least with the quarterback. I guess you got Garrett Wilson. Yeah. Yeah,
I was going to say I think one of Garrett Wilson or Breece Hall could have a decent game, but even still, the ceilings of this team are just so low when I don't see the touchdown upside. I don't like the play calling. And like we said with Abanikanda, it's kind of unclear if they're just throwing the towel in and seeing what they have with some of these auxiliary pieces.
Yeah, Washington's kind of in a similar position. They benched Sam Howell for Jacoby Brissett, who made it a game late against the Rams last week, Josh. You like Brissett entering this season? I would imagine after that performance, he probably gets to start here against a difficult Jets defense. Yeah, you have anything on Washington?
Yeah, Antonio Gibson, for all the enthusiasts out there, the role didn't really increase. We had Chris Rodriguez with 10 carries. We had Antonio Gibson with 4. Gibson had the 5 targets to 0 for Rodriguez, but overall, it just seems like Gibson was stuck once again in this change of pace receiving back role. This was definitely Terry McLaurin's best game. He had a couple of incredible catches. One of them was ruled incomplete after further review, but it was this ridiculous one-handed snag down the left sideline that I think showed that this is one of the NFL's best receivers, even if the quarterback play just hasn't been there. McLaurin finished with a team-high 12 targets. He caught only 6 of them, but it was for 141 yards and a touchdown. He had 238 air yards, which was encouraging. And Curtis Samuel, the luck box season continues. He had 48 air yards to McLaurin's 238, but somehow they decided that he was going to have 41 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns. So congratulations to Samuel. We'll be watching this week to see if Howell gets the start. All indications are that Howell will be starting this game against the Jets and that this was just a temporary bench. We'll kind of see. I don't really trust Sam Howell, and I think what we saw last week was an abomination.
Titans versus Seahawks is up next. Titans are 2.5-point home underdogs, 42.5-point game total here. Derrick Henry was shut down by the Texans' new coaching regime. He completely destroyed Houston in the previous, I think it was 5 matchups, had 200 yards rushing in 5 of 6 or 4 or 5 matchups before that, got completely shut down. Kind of an ugly game against Houston in general. I think Will Levis has some positive qualities about him, but I'm not really looking to bet on him with any kind of money on the line at this point. What do you think about Tennessee here, Josh?
Ryan, I've got a couple stats here that are going to blow you and the people's mind. So Will Levis had an average depth of target of 15 yards. 15 yards on average. That's ridiculous. 26 pass attempts, 391 air yards, just 199 actual passing yards. He also took 7 sacks. Only Jameis Winston in week 10 has any game this year with a higher average throw depth. And then here's the funny stats. So DeAndre Hopkins, because you're like, well, there's got to be a funny stat, right? When These are just empty yardage. Yes, Hopkins had 9 targets. That was a 35% target share. He caught 2 of them for 21 yards. 21 yards on 9 targets and 200 air yards. That one made me chuckle. But then maybe the funnier one in a sick way is just the decline of the big dog. He has talked about how he does not really have plans to stay in Tennessee after this year. The Titans are now mathematically eliminated from playoff contention. We might see more Tajay Spears. Derrick Henry had 16 carries for 9 yards. He had 4 receptions for 1 yard. This does not make sense. He had 20 touches for 10 yards. Statistically, this might be the worst yardage output. If I have time later, I'll look this up to confirm. It would not surprise me if this is the first time someone's had at least 20 touches in a game with only 10 total yards. So congrats to the big dog after multiple 200-yard performances. What was it? Like 4 of his past 5 games against the Titans were at least 200 rushing yards. So then this week he was definitely due for 20 touches and 10 total yards.
Yeah, his dominance of Houston sounds made up, and it's finally come to an end. And I'm not looking forward to him in Philly next year because, Derrick Henry is kind of an alien. Buccaneers versus Jaguars. Bucks are 1-point home underdogs, 43.5-point game total here. I've been critical of Baker Mayfield for years now, so I'm going to say very nice things about him. He went out and lit Green Bay up in a very big game. He spearheaded that win. He more or less carried Tampa Bay. To that end, though, Rachaad White continues to be productive on the ground. So all of a sudden, Tampa's a team with a capable defense that has a more well-balanced offense. What do you think about the Bucs here, Josh?
Yeah, the Buccaneers had a great day. Baker Mayfield, 381 yards, 4 touchdowns, a perfect 158.3 quarterback rating. And Bucs fans out there may not like to hear this, but I think Baker Mayfield's getting an extension. I think he might get paid. Yeah. At this point, he's averaging 237 passing yards per game. That's above average. 24 passing touchdowns, only 8 picks. Over 7 yards per pass attempt, a 95 quarterback rating. I don't think he's actually the future of any kind of Super Bowl contender. No. But with the Buccaneers looking like they've got a good chance to make the playoffs at the very least now, probably winning the division. They're in the driver's seat right now. They kind of control their destiny. If they beat the Saints in week 17, it's pretty much over, and the division is theirs. Yeah. So if I was a Bucs fan, I'd be terrified of that. I would have hoped for the tank season and Drake May or Caleb Williams. But hey, you're probably going to be giving Baker $30 million a year for 4 years. So buckle up for that one. I don't have too many other notes. It's a very predictable offense. Godwin had the target spike in this game, but again, if it's not going to be Evans or White, it's going to be Godwin. One note that I had, Jacksonville is a pass funnel defense. The Buccaneers are a pass funnel defense overall. The game total is 43.5. You can get it at 43 on Bet365, and I actually took the over at 43 at -110. We talked about it before with the Browns and how you can have a non-functioning offense that still puts up points and yards just through the pass game. And I don't really see the Bucs or Jags being able to keep this game on 43 points.
You know what's interesting here, Josh? Here's an alternative path here. That they franchise Baker Mayfield and he makes more money than Patrick Mahomes next year. I think that's on the table here.
Very in the cards.
One comment I want to make about this game in general is if this game happened 4 weeks ago, I think the Jaguars would be 3.5 point favorites on the road here. The fact that they're just 1 point road favorites is kind of telling on how they've played lately. Sloppy game against the Ravens on Sunday night. They left a lot of points on the board, missed field goals, the whole shebang. That game could have been much closer. The defense actually played reasonably well against Lamar Jackson. Again, we'll talk about the Ravens offense later, but they exceeded my expectations a little bit. I don't think Trevor Lawrence is the problem. The team just didn't finish last week, and they have a tough matchup here against the Bucs. Do you trust any of these Jaguars players in this spot here, Josh?
Fortunately, we're going to get a very consolidated offense. Travis Etienne's been frustrating with the lack of rushing efficiency, but he is averaging nearly 30 receiving yards a game on 3.5 catches. That's kind of buoyed a lot of his fantasy performances this year. Zay Jones, week to week with a hamstring injury, he's probably out. We already know Christian Kirk's not playing again this regular season. Calvin Ridley was just force-fed 12 targets this past week. I think a lot more is in store for him and tight end Evan Engram. So I think Ridley and Engram are the two guys that we're definitely starting. Obviously, we're starting ETN as well. But at the very least, it's nice that the pass game's consolidated. One note that I had was just some of the weird clock management stuff to end the first half by the Jaguars. There were like 15 seconds left. They're at like the 5-yard line. And Trevor Lawrence threw a swing pass to the left to Parker Washington. And it wasn't even clear if Washington was able to get out of bounds or not. They ended up ruling that he was inbounds. Either way, the fact that you have a close call like that just doesn't make any sense. Why would you call that play? Why would Lawrence throw that ball? Lawrence had a ball stripped on a sack. He lost a fumble pretty badly on another play. Just overall, I wasn't impressed with the play calling or with Lawrence in this one.
That fumble may have been the worst fumble of the year. And let me also throw this at you, Josh. It's week 16. I have a handful of fantasy teams, still alive. If I see Calvin Ridley on like a 5 seed that I have to play this week, it actually worries me a little bit. I think he has a massive ceiling in this spot. Dolphins, Cowboys, Josh, big one here. Dolphins are 1.5-point home favorites. Game total here is 51 points. On the Dolphins side of things, encouraging bounce back win against the Jets last week. They fired on both sides of the ball, played really well. The offense playing so well without Hill against the Jets defense was, pretty encouraging too. The Jets defense is at least an equivalent group to Dallas in terms of talent. I don't entirely trust Miami in the playoffs, in part because their offense is very reliant on timing, and good teams are more likely to disrupt timing. But they're dangerous enough to make a run through an AFC that's not quite as good as we thought. But in this matchup, Josh, what are you thinking here with the big pieces of Miami?
Yeah, I think they got away with it against a Jets team that's just kind of quit on the season. They need Tyreek Hill for this game against the Cowboys. And all reports say that Tyreek Hill is expected to suit up once again. I thought this past week's game was just a great reminder at how good Jalen Waddle is and that he'd be a wide receiver 1 on most NFL teams. He caught 8 of his 9 targets for 142 yards and a touchdown. It came on just 79 air yards, which I actually don't think was an indictment on Waddle. It's that they trust him after the catch. He's ridiculously fast. And he was gaining separation early in his routes, which you can't really ask for much more than that. So assuming Hill plays, I think this is going to be the second most exciting game of the week. We have a good one coming up that we'll discuss at the end of the show.
That's true. I like that. And, to add on to your Waddle point here, Josh, I think Jalen Waddle might be the only player in the league where if Tyreek Hill's down, you can actually have him play a similar role to Tyreek Hill without restricting it too much. So I'm with you all the way there, man. On the Cowboys side of things, I thought they'd lose to Buffalo. I said it on shows. I wrote it in Expert Picks. I was not expecting them to get absolutely blown out, though. That said, Josh, a key takeaway here is Arizona beat Dallas on the ground with a physical game plan, manhandled them in the trenches. Buffalo beat them on the ground too, but I'd call that more about speed than physicality. Mike McDaniel's macro game plan is probably the thing I'm looking forward to most this year from a micro standpoint, because I wonder if he's going to try to just run the ball down Dallas's throat until they stop him. What do you think about the Cowboys here, Josh?
Yeah, the only note that I really have, since I think all the usage was fairly predictable this past week, I think the Dak MVP conversation came to an abrupt halt. It's tough to remain in this race when Purdy had the massive game, which we'll discuss later, and Dak threw for 134 yards in negative game script pretty much the entire game. No touchdown passes, 1 interception. The 134 passing yards sounds bad, and then you realize that it was under 4 yards per attempt and just how much he was passing. And I don't know about you, but I think the 40-1 ticket you have was extremely sharp, but I don't think it's happening at this point, unfortunately. We might need a Purdy injury at the very least.
No, I mean, I just think they need to lose Baltimore for people to be alive. But we'll get into that. We'll get into that at the end. Next up, Josh, Bears versus Cardinals. Bears are 4-point home favorites here. Game total here is 44.5. Bears defense continues to play at a high level. Looking forward to talking about this group in depth in the offseason. It's probably the most improved unit from the first half to the second half of the season, I'd say. Offense is another playmaker away. Again, going to be very interesting to see what they do in the draft. Offensive line did a reasonably solid job against Cleveland. Pretty much mitigated Myles Garrett for the most part, who's just like an absolute unicorn freak athlete. Arizona, we just saw them get shredded by San Francisco. Obviously, the Bears offense is not the 49ers offense, but Justin Fields has a pretty high ceiling. DJ Moore's gone nuts this season with Fields. What do you think about the Bears' key pieces here?
Yeah, I think the unfortunate part was that we thought we might have some clarity at running back with Foreman as the workhorse. And I have no idea what to do now because Roshan Johnson last week, or I guess 2 weeks ago in week 14, had the fewest touches in this backfield. And then this past week, he had the most touches in a game where game script was actually in favor of Deonta Foreman. Yet, rather than Foreman doing anything, he had 6 carries for -6 yards. Khalil Herbert had 6 carries for 8 yards. And then Roshan Johnson, far more explosive. He only carried 5 times for 36 yards, but he caught 4 of 6 targets. He had 24 receiving yards. Herbert had 4 receiving yards. Foreman didn't do anything in the receiving game. So maybe it's Roshan this week. I really don't know what to do with this backfield. And it's really unfortunate. The Cardinals, when you adjust for schedule, are the second best matchup for fantasy running backs. Running back rooms average nearly 7 more fantasy points per game against the Cardinals than what you would expect. So I really don't have much here other than we'll start Justin Fields, we'll start DJ Moore. Cole Kmet's always that low-end fantasy tight end 1. And then outside of that, there's really not much positively to say about anything we can predict.
Arizona had no answers for San Francisco's offense last week. That's not a major surprise. That said, though, Josh, this offense played the best it has since Kyler Murray returned last week against the best defense in the league. Not exactly shocking that Murray's getting better as the season progresses, but again, big outing out of the whole group. James Conner was good on the ground, like we talked about. But Trey McBride, Josh, big part of the offense. More importantly, big part of the early game plan. What are we thinking about McBride, Hollywood, Conner, Murray? You like any of these guys this week?
Ryan, I think I'm finally going to have to get off of the Marquise Brown train. He had an early heel injury. He didn't have any fantasy points. He didn't do anything last week. I think at this point, he's just playing really hurt. And that if he does suit up, I'm just not going to be that excited. We've given him too many chances. This heel injury that's been nagging for a month now just appears to be really severe. And I think that's great news for Trey McBride. He's been an absolute monster with the target shares, with the production. He's fast. Anytime you have a fast tight end who's getting 8 targets a game, good things are going to happen in fantasy. And then I'm optimistic about Kyler Murray and just in general, his rushing. And then I'm very optimistic about James Conner in this run game. It was so incredibly efficient against that banged up 49ers front. Conner had a long run of 44 yards. Amari DiMercado had a long run of 49 yards. Even Michael Carter had 3 carries for 27 yards himself. I think we could have a lot more of the same from this run game against the Bears.
Kind of an odd Sunday night game on Christmas Eve. Broncos versus Patriots. Broncos are 6-point home favorites. 34.5-point game total here. Denver's in a bounce back spot after getting blown out by Detroit last week. You know, we talked about this last week. Detroit was kind of a nightmare matchup for Denver because, you know, Denver's struggled against the run, but they're good against the pass. Lions offensive line, great backfield, so on and so forth. But like I mentioned before, I was disappointed in the Broncos offense this last week. I thought they were going to give a better showing, especially since Detroit just was so red hot on offense. They don't need much against New England here, Josh, but for fantasy purposes, is there anything we like here?
Yeah, Javonte Williams has had a terrible fantasy season. I don't think we've really talked about that much. He was coming off the ACL and more injury this offseason, where he had the ACL, MCL, PCL, everything was shredded from the middle of last season. Ultimately, at this point, we've seen the Broncos be pretty run-heavy at times, and I think it's coming back to get them now. Javonte Williams is averaging 3.7 yards per carry. His long run this year is 21 yards. He's averaging only 5 yards per reception. His long reception is 18 yards. You simply can't have a workhorse running back with that type of efficiency and be a consistent offense each week. Russ has been pretty efficient overall, and I think you'd like down the stretch as they're fighting for one of those final wild card spots to see them just pass more.
Agreed. The New England, I don't have much to say about New England here, Josh. You know, I'm a Bill Belichick guy strategically, but this team continues to play hard. Bailey Zappi's been pretty good compared to what we saw the previous month from Mac Jones and Zappi coming in relief duty. New England, simply put, just has a limited roster. Denver's, you know, still in the playoff race. I'm a little concerned here for the Patriots. But what do you think about New England here, Josh?
Yeah, positively, the Patriots were up 10-7 against the Chiefs with 5 minutes left in the second quarter. And then the other positive for fantasy is that Zeke, once again, was a bell cow. He had 11 of the team's 15 running back carries, 3 of the 4 red zone carries, and he ran 23 routes to running back Kevin Harris's 2. Zeke now has at least 5 receptions in both games this season. They should be trailing against the Broncos. And I think there's a good chance that he has 4 to 7 catches once again in week 16.
We have a 3-game slate on Christmas on Monday, Josh. First up, the Chiefs versus the Raiders. Chiefs are 10-point home favorites. Game total here is 43 points. I don't like that the Raiders are playing the Chiefs here because I was chomping at the bit to bet against them after their blowout win over the Chargers, but 10 points is, what this line should be. I don't really see any value there. New England shut down Travis Kelce for the most part. That's not a surprise. Even when Tyreek Hill was a Chief, Bill Belichick focused his game plan from a macro sense on limiting Travis Kelce most of the time. Rashee Rice stepped up. We talked about that as a thing that needed to happen last week. Run game was non-existent, though, without Isaiah Pacheco, Josh. What are we thinking in this matchup against the Raiders?
It seems like Pacheco's going to play in week 16. He had 2 rushing touchdowns the last time the Raiders and Chiefs played earlier this year. Pacheco back on the fantasy RB1 radar, assuming he suits up. And one note is that Clyde Edwards-Helaire's usage was just much better than McKinnon. And McKinnon looks slow. Fortunately for McKinnon, they just keep scheming in plays at the goal line. He had a little shovel pass to Rashee Rice for a touchdown, and he caught a touchdown reception from Mahomes at the goal line as well. Even with 2 touchdowns, McKinnon only had 12 fantasy points because he just doesn't get yards. He's just not good anymore. Clyde Edwards-Helaire had this pretty incredible reception in this game, and I think he's really, if you're going to stash a Chiefs running back at this point with Pacheco coming back, I would much heavily prefer Clyde Edwards-Helaire with the usage and how he looks better. And we now have 4 straight games. Rashee Rice, at least 9 targets, at least 7 catches, at least 64 receiving yards. He's averaging 21 fantasy points per game over his past 4 games and remains in the high-end fantasy RB2, wide receiver 2 conversation.
The Raiders side of things, Josh, you have to give them credit for just torching the Chargers last Thursday. I'll continue to say this about the Vegas defense. Again, one of the units that have exceeded my expectations more than others. Vikings defense might be them in terms of defenses this year. Very impressed. I'm basically throwing last week out, though, for the most part. That game doesn't even exist to me when I'm talking about evaluating the Raiders, apart from I was hoping the market would overvaluate them, but that's not happening here. So what for fantasy purposes, though, Josh, is there anything that you're enthusiastic about with the Raiders here?
I'm optimistic about Zamir White. Should Josh Jacobs miss? He had 17 carries to Amir Abdullah's 6 in this game. He ran for 69 yards and a touchdown. He's the only one that touched the ball in the red zone from this running back room. And he ran 22 routes to Amir Abdullah's 9. I thought Abdullah was going to be the clear receiving back. He has the resume. Zamir White was not a pass catcher in college. And then sure enough, Zamir White was trusted in that area and got 4 targets. So if I know that a running back can have 17 carries and 4 targets, it faces more of a run funnel defense with the Chiefs. And we've already seen what the Raiders' game plans have been the last 6 weeks. Zamir White's going to be a fantasy RB2 if Josh Jacobs misses.
The second game on the Christmas Day slate is Eagles versus Giants. Eagles are 10.5-point home favorites. Game total here is 43.5. We'll see Philly tonight. They have the raw materials to, blow the doors off the Giants here. Obviously, the game total, the spread's 10.5 points for a reason. And for me, Josh, on Christmas Day, I'll spend my Christmas Day with my sister's family. So we're talking 2 adults and 4 kids that are Eagles fans. My little niece will be told to tell me that the Giants suck, and they do. So looking forward to that, Josh. I have mixed feelings about the Tommy DeVito stuff. I'm a Jersey guy, so I'm a big fan of the chicken cutlets, Italian sandwiches. If you haven't had them, you should have them. But at the end of the day, this guy's, at a Cooper Rush level backup quarterback is how I'd frame it, that takes more sacks. He took 7 against the Saints last week. He could take 30 against this Philly pass rush if he took 7 against the Saints. So that's my biggest concern here on the Giants end. I don't see how they're going to score points because Tommy DeVito has to beat this team through the air, and he's not going to have any time. So what do you got here on the Giants, Josh?
Yeah, the one positive is Darren Waller. Returned from injury, 6 targets. He caught 4 for 40 yards. I think he's kind of the play here where I might rank him as high as tight end 7 or 8 this week because I think this Eagles pass rush will be overwhelming. He operates fairly close to the line of scrimmage. He's still explosive whenever he's actually healthy. So I think he's going to be the one bright spot in this offense.
Monday Night Football, Josh, Christmas night. AI gave us 49ers versus Ravens. Let's not give it on a normal Monday night. Let's do it when we're all shot from spending Christmas Day with people. 49ers are 5-point favorites here, which I think would surprise a lot of people. I think that's kind of right. 45.5-point game total here. You mentioned MVP before, Josh, and for me with Brock Purdy, I mentioned him at 2 intervals this year to bet on him. One was in week 4 or 5 because he was at the top of EPA rating, quarterback rating. What's the other one? QBR. He was in the MVP conversation because of that. Then after their 3-game losing skid before they played the Jaguars, same deal. I thought he was undervalued. He's been at the top of those categories for most of the season. Here's my thing here. One, Christian McCaffrey leads the league in rushing by 324 yards. No quarterback has ever won the MVP before while their teammates led the league in rushing. McCaffrey also leads all receivers and running backs in receiving yards too. And then on the other hand, the 49ers are allowing the second fewest points per game currently. I think there a few things need to happen here. One, they definitely need to beat Baltimore. If the 49ers lose to Baltimore, the MVP race is open, and I think Dak, Lamar Jackson, Purdy, obviously, and I think people might talk themselves into Christian McCaffrey in that scenario. I actually think he's kind of interesting right now because if Purdy doesn't win, Lamar hasn't been productive enough. Dak has, but like you just said, like that was a nationally televised game and they bombed, so they have to win out for them to even be live. But for this particular game, Josh, this is one of the best games of the year. What are you thinking about with the 49ers offense in this one?
Yeah, I think the 49ers continue to be just ridiculously efficient on offense. We talked about it a little bit a couple weeks ago, and I said I was betting against George Kittle's receptions. And I think I'm going to look more into these lines continuously because Brock Purdy is now pacing for 4,600 passing yards, 35 passing touchdowns. He's throwing for 9.9 yards per pass attempt, which is absolutely unheard of. And when you think about 4,600 passing yards and 35 touchdowns, you don't think 27 pass attempts per game, which is, but what is that, like 20% below the league average? So on a team that has significantly lowered volume, I think they're like the sixth, I think they have like the 6th fewest attempts or something this year, but then they have like the second most actual raw stats in the passing game. And what we keep seeing is that all these receivers can struggle in fantasy any given week. And this kind of happened this past week where Brandon Ayuk can't do much on 5 targets, 3 catches, 37 yards. Kittle had 4 targets, 2 catches, 54 yards. The hope here is that the Ravens offense can push them because despite the score being pretty high in that Cardinals-Niners game, it really didn't feel all that close for most of it. Yeah. And we just keep seeing that if it's not a close game, the Niners just do not need to open up the game plan. They do not need to show any kind of volume. And the playmakers here are just too good. In this one, it was the Christian McCaffrey show. 115 yards on the ground, 72 yards through the air, 3 total touchdowns, 42 fantasy points. He looks like the best round 1 pick in fantasy this year.
Sure is. I'll add a few things too here. Ayuk dropped the deep shot. Great throw by Purdy. I actually think Purdy's been ridiculous this year. I moved him to number 1, the 49ers to number 1 in power rankings after opening day because of Purdy. Pressure management, everything. But, again, this team isn't – baseball had a moment like this where it's like, okay, so what does MVP mean? And with this team, there's just so many ways they can win. They have the best running back in the league. They have the best defense in the league, and Purdy's just shredding people. So I'm very curious to see how that plays out ultimately because it's going to be like a bit of a – if he wins – we can say that awards markets are more of an analytics driven thing going forward.
One thing we talked about pre-show was should we just give John Lynch, their GM, the MVP award for this roster?
Yeah, I mean, he should be in the consideration at least. For the Ravens side of things, the thing with Baltimore is they're always good. They've been good for so long with very few blips. Even when Lamar Jackson's out, they're a good team. They make very few mistakes. One of the reasons for it, very buttoned up on defense. And that's rare and genuinely important. Very few teams. One of the reasons the Patriots were so good is they didn't make mistakes for 20 years. Now with Lamar Jackson, again, when I see him, I don't see like, elite passer. I see a good passer where the thing that makes him special is one, his speed and his rushing ability. And the way he can extend plays is different than anyone else. He can run around for 10 seconds and create throws that no one else can. That's where I think his value is. Going to be very curious to see how he looks against this defense, though. I think this is going to be a slight under, but this is what I call a variable game. If this shut out a little bit, it's certainly on the table. What do you got on Baltimore, Jeff?
Yeah, a few interesting notes. Lamar only threw for the 171 passing yards against Jacksonville, but he made up for it. 12 carries, 97 rushing yards, Speaking of rushing, we saw Keaton Mitchell have a catastrophic knee injury. He tore his ACL. He will not play the rest of this year. Fantasy-wise, that's good news for Gus Edwards. He already had out-carried Mitchell 16-9 last week because Mitchell got injured in the fourth quarter. Edwards had 2 of the 3 red zone carries, and then he had all 4 of the goal line carries. I think Edwards gets 15 to 20 carries rest of season, all the red zone goal line work, Justice Hill mixing in on pass downs. And we just saw this Niners team get shredded by the Cardinals on the ground. I think there's a sneaky Gus Edwards game here. We'll look at the prop markets, but there's a chance that some Gus Edwards alt lines could be in play here for this matchup. And then the last note is we've talked a few times about how we just can't predict this pass game. And I think this past week was just the perfect example. Rashad Bateman only ran half the routes. He tied with Isaiah Likely for the team lead with 6 targets apiece. Odell Beckham Jr. and Zay Flowers, their 2 best receivers, combined for 5 targets, 2 catches, and 21 yards against the Jaguars, who really have no business shutting down any passing attacks. Folks, before we go, Ryan's done a lot of heavy lifting for this show. He does a lot of heavy lifting on the 33rdteam.com. Ryan Reynolds NFL on Twitter. Make sure that you check out his power rankings that hit the site tomorrow. Thursday, his expert picks and predictions for every game come out. And then for this weekend, you'll have what he's betting on in each and every game. Despite it being about a week away from Christmas, we are still working hard this week for the good people. My fantasy rankings hit the site tomorrow. From myself, Josh Larky, from my co-host, Ryan Reynolds, from the 33rd team, thank you, everyone.